Do you like post-colonial, postmodernism, magic realism in your novels? Me neither. Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie. We have 2 questions to answer. First of all, did I enjoy reading it? 3 possible answers. No, kinda, and yes. Midnight's Children gets a kinda, maybe even a kinda minus. The second question, and the most important question, is, do I want to reread ever Midnight's Children? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Welcome to Whiskey and Literature, where we read and discuss the greatest books of all time, the best stories that have ever been put to paper, and maybe occasionally the worst books, and all of those in between, because all the books, they are ours. And while we're turning those pages, we're sipping the finest distilled spirits that are out there. I'm Captain Mike, I'm your host, and I thank you for being with me. I watched a YouTube on the 50 greatest books of all time and set myself a goal to read all of them in 2023 and added 2 for good measure to get to 52 books in 52 weeks. I decided to create this channel to share these experiences and the reviews of these books with you. This will be my first review of the year, Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. Before we talk about Midnight's Children, let's talk about Salman Rushdie. When you're reading these classic books, it's good to get to know the author just a little bit, to get to understand his perspective and where he's coming from. Salman Rushdie is an Indian-born British American, born just a few months before the main character of the story was born, just a few months before India gained its independence from Britain. Salman Rushdie, this was his second novel, written in 1981. It won the Booker Prize and the Booker of Bookers Prize. Honestly, before I decided to read this book and all these books, all I knew from Salman Rushdie was satanic verses and fatwa. Salman's 4th novel, Satanic Verses, actually caused the supreme leader Ayatollah Khomeini to issue a fatwa against them. And he was no stranger to controversy. In this novel, the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, no relation to Mahatma Gandhi, sued and won and had Salman Rushdie remove one line from this book, which she thought was slandering her and her children. Okay, let's talk about the stats and the specs for this book. I purchased this copy on Amazon for $9.63. I also purchased this book on Audible so I could listen to it while I was commuting to and from work, and that cost me $23.58. This book is also available on Kindle for $13.69. So there's a wide variety in prices. Of course, if you buy it in hardcover, and there's some other editions available, but that roughly gives you an idea of what this book would run you. It's not one of the free ones that were on Audible. I listened to it and I read it, and I kind of alternated a few chapters here and there depending on how much I could listen to as I was commuting to work. And then when I was at home, I would just read the paperback. And my recommendation after having listened and read separate chapters of this book is this is a reader book. This is not a listen to book. A couple reasons why. Actually, I really enjoyed the narrator. I thought he did a great job as far as his inflections and his accent and all the things, the way he did the voices and the narration. Everything was great. But it was difficult for me to actually understand. There are a lot of words in here that if I'm listening to them, I don't actually understand it. And when I can read it and see it, I can put it in my mind. And when I see it again, I know that I've already seen it and it makes more sense. And even some of the names, it really helped in my mind to be reading the book instead of listening to it. I did enjoy the narration, but if I had to do this book again, I would absolutely 100% read it and not listen to it. So I mentioned the three genres that this book encompasses earlier in this video: post-colonial, postmodernism, and magic realism. Let's talk about those. Post-colonial, that should be self-evident. That genre deals with the immediate aftermath when a colony gains its independence from the country that was ruling it for however long. India was a colony of Britain until 1947, and this book encompasses between 1915 and 1977. He actually started this book before the final events in the book occurred. I thought that was fairly interesting. And post-independence, India became India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Postmodern is not quite as intuitive to understand. Postmodern authors tend to reject the idea of meaning in their novels, or they put forth the possibility of multiple meanings or the complete lack of meanings in their novels. Typically, you'll have an unreliable narrator, and it'll be set amidst historical and political issues of the time. Magical realism is characterized by the introduction of impossible or unrealistic events slipped into a narrative that is otherwise realistic. Fantasy or magic put into the story, but not the focus of the story. An example that you might think of would be Harry Potter. It's a semi-realistic world, but in this example, it's not magical realism because the magic is the focus of the story. Now let's talk about the structure or what actually occurs in the story of Midnight's Children. It begins 2 generations before Salim Sinai is born. His grandfather goes to Heidelberg, Germany, becomes a doctor, and returns to Kashmir as a doctor. And he's excited to return. But of course, it's not the same. I think there's a beautiful description in this book. I'm just seeing this in my mind as he's standing in front of this valley and he's looking through this beautiful, snow-capped, towering, majestic mountains, this place that he loves and he has always considered to be his home. And he went away and he came back and it's not the same. I was really feeling that as I was reading this moment in the book. And I know that there's other books that I've read that have this kind of same central theme where the character departs, learns, grows, develops, comes back, and feels like where he's at now is small and tiny and tight and not what he thought was his home. And he's sad, and you can feel that. I really, really felt that as I was reading this story. But I couldn't think of any titles offhand. Do you know of any books that have this central theme in it of leaving and returning home? If so, comment below. So the doctor begins practicing medicine in his village. But by and large, they reject him and his medicine, except for one family that had a young daughter. But the father was very sly. He didn't let the doctor see his daughter. He would have a sheet over the daughter, and the doctor could only see her 7 inches at a time. He cut a hole in the middle of the sheet, and whatever was paining her, he would see and examine, whether it was her foot or her knee or her elbow or her stomach. And slowly he fell in love with the idea of this woman. He would lay in wake at night wondering, what does she look like? Is she laying in bed right now thinking about me? All she's ever seen of me are my hands. Until finally, one day, she complained of a headache. And so finally, they put the hole over her head and he saw her. And they were married. And they were unhappy in their village. And they moved away. So they have several children, including Mumtaz, who becomes Amina Sinai. I don't know if it's everyone in India who, when the girl gets married, takes a new name, but every girl in this story who got married was given a new name. So Amina Sinai becomes the mother of Salim Sinai. So Salim Sinai is born at midnight, the stroke of midnight, the same night, the same morning, the same time that India gains its independence from Britain. And all the children that are born between the stroke of midnight and 1 a.m. are the Midnight's children. 1,001 children that have telepathic powers. Salim is the strongest of all the Midnight's children because he is born closest to midnight. And his power is that he can talk to each of the Midnight's children. And at first, it's individually he can talk to them. And then later on, he develops his power so that he can talk to all of them at the same time and bring them all into the same conference where they plan these large, huge, great ideas. Imagine a large Zoom call between 1,001 kids all talking and planning the future of India. Okay, I'm going to mention here 2 episodes in the book about how Salim gained his power or understood that he had the power, allowed it to awaken in him. And it just will show you maybe how odd this book really is. So the first, when Salim was 9 years old, he liked to hide in the washing chest. I imagine the washing chest was a big clothes hamper, and for some reason it was in the bathroom. And he loved to lay in there. It was his safe place, and he would hide and he would snuggle among the sheets and the clothes and the underwear. And Salim has a large nose. It is his main feature, a huge nose, and it is always dripping, dripping, dripping. So he's hiding in here one day inside the washing chest, and inside comes his mom. His mom has been receiving phone calls that have been wrong numbers and leaving the house at different times, and she's been kind of sad. She comes into here after one of these phone calls, and she's crying and sobbing, and she begins moaning and crying a name, Nadir, Nadir, and she says it over and over and over again. And then she begins touching herself, and then she begins masturbating. So Salim Sinai, a 9-year-old boy inside the washing chest through a peephole, is watching his mom masturbate. And then she finishes, stands up, takes all her clothes off to use the commode. She bends over, facing away from him, to pick her clothes up. At the same time, a pajama bottom string went up Salim's nose, caused him to sneeze, but he still saw what he saw. And I'm only mentioning this because this is actually mentioned very frequently, this moment throughout the entire book. So his mom realizes that her son is in the washing chest and punishes him. For 24 hours, he cannot speak. Salim must be silent. And it is in this time of introspection and silence that Salim meets and awakens his telepathic powers and becomes able to talk to each of the Midnight children. In the second occurrence, he was riding a bicycle, which he didn't know how to ride, and he hit another kid. They struck their heads. He was unconscious for a while, and that's when he gained the power to be able to allow all the Midnight's children to, instead of talking to them individually, talk to them all and bring them all into a large conference. Those are the 2 events in the story that allowed Salim Sinai to awaken his powers and expand on them. And from this point, I'm basically going to skip the rest of the book because the next 20 years of Salim's life is what the book is about and what is happening to him. But it's not really happening to him. It's happening to India, or he's causing it to happen to India, or it happens simultaneously. I'm not really sure. He's causing it, or it's happening at the same time. Magic realism. After that story, I think this is as good a time as any to introduce the whiskey of the week. And you didn't just think I was going to do bourbons and ryes, did you? Here's coming at you an Irish whiskey. Not just any Irish whiskey, but the Jameson 18. And you might have noticed the bottle's empty. That's because it's good stuff. If you read the back of the label, it says it's full of toffee, spices, and rich nuttiness. I don't actually get any of that because I don't have that refined nosing ability. I just know it's good whiskey. I'm starting to learn bad whiskey, good whiskey, Irish whiskey versus scotches versus ryes versus bourbons, the good stuff and the not so good stuff. And this is the good stuff. So little stats on this, $169 for this bottle of the Jameson 18 at Total Wine and More. Pretty available. I think anytime you could walk down to just about any decent liquor store and get a bottle of Jameson 18. And now that this last pour here is going down, I will be getting a new one this week. So, cheers. Okay, let's talk about what I did or didn't actually like about this book, or why I gave it a no to the reread. First of all, in the book, it is the story in a linear fashion of Salim's grandfather all the way to Salim's son. But it's told in a way that Salim is actually in his later years, right before he passes away. He's writing down his life story and he's narrating it to his future bride, Padma. And this is one of the problems with listening to the story instead of reading the story. When I listened to the first couple chapters and then I read, it made more sense to me. The story is coming along, and then occasionally they step out of the story mid-chapter, mid-sentence almost. Salim Sinai is talking to Padma. I got lost sometimes while listening to this story. I didn't realize we had switched to the Salim talking to Padma. It just didn't make as much sense to me. But if you're reading it, it's clear as day. It's easy to understand. So I'm going to read the first line of this book because I read it and I read it again. And it just says, I was born in the city of Bombay once upon a time. So it kind of sounds like it's starting out as an autobiography, but then once upon a time sounds like a fairy tale. So is it an autobiography or is it a fairy tale? I think it's both. And one of the later chapters, Salim Sinai is talking to Padma. He's explaining to her that all the events that are happening in India after his birth, in fact, during his birth, every event that occurred of note is because of him. In fact, every hard date that they have in this book is a date when something was happening to India, something big and historical, good and bad. There is a whole world of the history of India that I had no idea of. And I did learn quite a bit through reading this book, but I was completely ignorant of it before opening the book. One of the characteristics of this book is exaggerated physical characteristics. It seems like all the characters have something large or abnormal, or something happens to them. Their thoughts, their feelings, their curses, their hopes, their dreams, they're all physically manifested in each character in some way. Salim Sinai, huge nose. Pavarti the witch, big saucer eyes. Salim's arch nemesis, Shiva, has knobby knees that he somehow kills people with his knobby knees, and he runs his gang with his vicious knobby knees. Salim's father has a business deal go bad, and with some gangsters, he is really scared and his balls turn blue. And his mom actually touched his balls and her hands froze. Just an example of the physical manifestation of things that are happening to these characters. Salim later in the story did not want to get married, and so he told his bride wannabe that he couldn't get married because he could never satisfy her, because they could never have kids because he was impotent. And one of the other characters said, you should be careful because if you're not, things happen. And it did happen. And he cursed himself into impotency. One of the clever things about the book that I kind of enjoyed, Salim's father was under the spell of the jinns. If you read the book, it's spelled like genie, D-J-I-N-N. If you're listening to the audiobook, all you hear is jinn. Occasionally you hear gin and tonic. If you're reading the book, you might initially believe he's actually under the spirit or under the spell of evil genies until you realize that no, it's actually gins and tonics and whiskeys that he's under the spell of. Let's talk about a couple things that I didn't like about the book, and there were quite a few. I honestly didn't feel anything for any character in this book. It's rare that I read a story and I don't feel like I can sympathize or place myself in the shoes of or like any character. The exception is Handmaid's Tale. If you ever watched that show, and I've watched 2 seasons, I believe, and I stopped watching it because I found myself not caring about any character in that entire show. And I felt like this book was the same way. I read the entire book and I enjoyed a very small part at the beginning when the grandfather came back to Kashmir. I was feeling that leaving and returning. Beyond that, from Salim Sinai, unlikable. To every other character in the book, I could not get behind any one of them. Didn't enjoy it. Another thing, some of his sentences were incredibly long, more than 1 page, literally with no punctuation. for an entire sentence. We have children and little kids who have having thoughts, and those chaotic thoughts are happening in their minds, and they're being expressed in the books, and there's no punctuation, which is, if you kind of imagine how a kid would be thinking, it does make sense, but it makes for difficult reading and even more difficult listening for you audiobook people. And let's talk about the title of the book, Midnight's Children. It's about 1,001 children that are born between midnight and 1 a.m. Salim Sinai does not discover these other midnight children who are ignorant of each other until he allows them to see each other. And by the time he finds them, of these 1,001 kids, 420 are dead. Natural causes, disease, accidents, whatever, 420 are dead. And what do they do in this book? The 1,001 or the 581 that are remaining when he finally discovers them. They meet, they talk, they discuss, and they don't do a thing. Nothing in this entire book. They don't do anything. They're not even together until the very last scene in the book when they're together in prison. That's the only time they're actually together, excepting for Shiva and Parvati the witch. Salim Sinai does not meet ever any of the midnight children in person except in that second to last chapter. They don't do anything. And even Salim Sinai does not do anything. Now, he thinks he is causing all these things that happen in India. He certainly has explanations by which each thing is happening. And his arch nemesis, Shiva, does become a major or a captain in the army and is doing things. But beyond that, they don't do anything. It's a story about them, and they don't do a dang thing. It's just an excuse to write a book about the post-colonial India. It reminds me of the book Under the Banner of Heaven. Have you seen the show or have you read the book by John Krakauer? It's about a couple murders that take place in rural Utah in the mid-'80s. This Mormon guy is converted to Mormon fundamentalism, and he kills his niece and his sister-in-law. And the book is about that. But the book is not really about that. The book is just using the story of the murders to be able to explore the violent history of the Mormon faith. This book uses the Midnight's Children to talk about the problems and the wars and the tragedies and the things that happened in India and Pakistan after the independence was gained. And it doesn't do a very good job, in my opinion. When I read sci-fi or read fantasy, it's oftentimes set in a culture or a universe that's beyond mine. It doesn't exist. I don't understand it. And the author knows that. And he takes the time to explain what is going on, what are the customs, what is happening in the story. Salman Rushdie, I felt like he just expected you to know what was going on and to follow along. And I was lost quite a bit of this story simply because I did not understand what was happening. And that made it kind of a bummer for me. Page 309, when Salim Sinai is narrating to Padma, and she's listening to his story, and he's talking about his history, and she says to him, "You're talking funny." That to me sums up the entire book. He was talking funny, and I was just lost quite a bit of the time, unfortunately. Because there were some really nice things in here, but overall difficult for me to understand. And let's talk about a couple of things that I did actually like. And they're just short sentences, little nuggets of gold in this book. But other than that, we will not be doing a reread. I enjoy learning some things about the Indian culture. Like numbers have meaning, have power. Like in the United States, lucky number 7, unlucky number 13, 666, 420 for some Americans means a certain something. In India, it is the number of tricksters, fraud, and deception, and it came across over and over and over as a theme in the book. Remember, 420 children were dead of the 1,001 Midnight's Children when Salim found them. And then there were 3 turns of phrases that I really enjoyed as I was reading the book, enough that I took note of them. The first, and I'm not going to explain them, I'm not going to discuss them, I'm just going to share them with you, and hopefully you enjoy them as much as I did, and maybe give you something to think about and ponder. The first is, what matters most in your life takes place in your absence. The second is, the sons of the great unmake their parents. And the third is, the great are eternally at the mercy of the tiny men. And then there was a fourth phrase that I enjoyed. I didn't write it down. It was very cliche, but I'm reading James Joyce, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man right now. And I heard this phrase, and it also came up in Midnight's Children a couple times. And the phrase is this: what cannot be cured must be endured. I just thought it was kind of funny that it was in both books, and enough to mention it in this video. So in conclusion for me, Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie was a bust. I just had a hard time reading it, didn't enjoy most of the story, didn't like any of the characters. The culture was just too dense for me to get behind. Did not know what was going on most of the time. So if you're interested in Indian culture and what happened, pick up the book. If you have to read it for an assignment in school, good luck with that. I would say read it, don't listen to it. Beyond that, I'm going to put this on my shelf and maybe donate it next year to my local bookstore. And now let's talk about the next book that's coming up in the next review, which I'm already halfway through that book because it's not a very big book. I'm reading James Joyce, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And I'm not going to spoil anything about how I'm feeling about the book. An Irish author writing a book about Irish people. And it's read by Colin Farrell in Audible. I'm listening to it and reading it. But that review will be coming up pretty soon because I'm almost done with the book already because it's like a 2-day read for me. For now, guys, turn those pages and stay thirsty.